Hello, my creative friends, and welcome to another episode of The Daily Prompt. This is your Saturday episode. My apologies for giving you such a big one on Saturday, but we're actually reverse engineering the process. Because we're reverse engineering the process, it just so happens that day 6 of the 7-phase day process lands on a Saturday, since we did start this on Monday. So if you're brand new here, you haven't watched these videos before, you don't know who I am or what this is all about, understand that this is day 6 of 7 to probably it's going to end up being around 10 days where we actually reverse engineer the complete creative process from idea to story to screenplay to the sale. We start at the end on Monday's episode, which was, I want to say 16, something like that. And we go one phase each day. We're now at the second to last one, which is actually the second phase of the process, which is the story development phase itself. If you have been watching along and you've already seen what yesterday's episode was about, yesterday was about getting the words on the page. And as we talked about in that episode, in order to make sure that we don't sort of go off the rails, we do want to make sure that we have developed our story before we begin the writing process. And I think this is something that a lot of particularly newer writers don't actually take the time to really do. And if you don't take the time to do it, it's very easy to go off on a tangent. It's very easy to go astray. Now, understanding the process itself, really, to once again, to sort of recap and work backwards, the end goal here, our target, what we're reaching for, is you writing a screenplay that actually connects with a producer who wants to turn it into a movie. How are you actually going to do that? We start at the sort of payoff phase, the end of the process, and show you how to capture their attention, draw them in, and get them to say yes to your project in the first place. Not an easy thing to do if you're just starting out, but there's the process. That's how we go about doing it. We'll get into specifics as we go along. But in order to actually connect with them, you need to make sure that you have a screenplay that's aligned with their immediate needs. So how do you align your project with their immediate needs? Well, you're going to have to get feedback and notes on your current project and understand how it lands so that you can adapt and tweak and adjust and modify your project to ensure that it lands with them the way you want it to land. And that way you're actually sending out there the story that you are passionate about and finding the producer that's ideal for your project. So how do we make sure that we get good quality notes? We make sure that we only send out page turner screenplays, what I call fast screenplays that read really fast. Once they start reading it, they cannot put it down. They just tear through it because they want to know what happens next because it's that good. So how do you do that? Well, you have to polish the story itself. The story has to be solid at that point. So you have to, once it's solid, you have to polish those words to make it an easy read, make it pull them through, make sure every single page gives them a reason to turn to the next page. There's lots of techniques and ideas and tools within that, which we'll cover as this series goes along. But before you can actually do the polishing and the tweaking of the project, you need to make sure that it's solid. You need to make sure that your story is everything that you wanted it to be when you set out on this adventure, right? So the way we do that is through the rewrite process. You have a draft that's maybe not working. How do we get it to a draft that is working? I mapped out in the other episode the sort of 6 levels of your story. So if you go through them one by one from broad to narrow, what you end up doing is you end up you go through your entire project with a fine-tooth comb at each of the layers of the thing. You make sure that you check off all the boxes. You know exactly what every single element does to serve your story, and then you can refine and rewrite from that point to make sure that it achieves what you want to achieve. So before you start refining and tweaking your project and tweaking the read itself, you have a solid story. That's what the rewrite process is all about. In order to rewrite something, working backwards, we have to have something in the first place. You have to take the idea that's in your head and you have to get it on the page. And that involves that, or, some people are doing the voice thing these days where they're dictating and it's transcribing. I find that doesn't work for me really because I can type really fast, and so my fingers think. If you just do a voice to text thing, you often spend a lot of time fixing it, or the nuances aren't quite right, or it's coming out in your voice and not necessarily as a story in the author's voice. anyway, there's lots of different ways to go about doing it, but ultimately you have to get your idea onto the page. Now, because ideas spark ideas, we want to make sure that when you sit down to actually write something, you have a solid framework of what you're going to write, so that you're basically giving your brain like guardrails, so that as ideas spark ideas and you start to go to veer off, you've got those little bumpers in place that keep you on track for the story that you're trying to tell. So ultimately, that's where story development comes in. Now, in my experience and what before I ever went down this road of trying to solve this problem and reverse engineer this, I had done lots of screenwriting courses and classes and been reading books and stuff since the early 90s, I would say. And I've read tons and tons of stuff. I've read all the gurus and all the masters and the books and all that stuff. And the vast majority of what is taught is right here in the story development phase. Most of what's taught is taught from a story building perspective. Now, my belief as someone who wants to build an independent film studio and not just write a screenplay or teach screenwriting, my goal is to create not just a story, but many stories, hundreds of viable projects, all of which have a unique voice, have a unique approach to story, have a unique perspective, maybe tell stories in different ways. I can't teach a formulaic approach to storytelling, because if I made 50 films that all followed that same dynamic, what you would very quickly see happening is the audience would watch your films and go, oh, okay, well, here's where the inciting incident happened and that triggered this response, so he's probably going to make this choice. And the audience starts to get ahead of you. Part of what makes a story effective is that you, the writer, stay ahead of the audience, that you're giving them a ride. The only way you can give them a ride is if you design something that understands what their expectations are, plays with those expectations, and then exceeds those expectations. So part of what story development is all about is about building a story and taking the audience on that emotional roller coaster. Now, if you're just sort of slotting ideas into specific beats or specific twists and turns based upon whatever story formula you're following, that stuff gets very predictable very fast. Now, that hasn't really necessarily been a problem through most of the film's history, but that's largely because we didn't live in this era where we just have story everywhere and we can start to see those patterns. The more we can start to see those patterns, the more we need to be able to shake it up. So my approach to story design, story development, is to actually start with what it is you're trying to say and then grow that organically into a story plan. Now, whether you follow the classic 3-act structure or this movie method or that 7-point process or however you want to do it, you can drop it right into this phase of the process. The story development phase is whatever approach to storytelling you want to use. The way that I go about doing it is the first thing that we do is we figure out what are you trying to say? Because ultimately every movie, every story is saying something, whether you intend it or not. So if you just set out to tell a silly comedy and you don't really have a message or a meaning or a purpose or any of that kind of thing, simply the choices that you make and what happens to the characters is going to convey a meaning to the audience. So meaning is the whole purpose of story. So the world intrinsically doesn't mean anything. It means something because we attach meaning to it. Because as things happen, we interpret the meaning of those things and we take away the lesson, the insight, the perspective, the view of the whole thing, whatever it might be. So understand that if your character makes certain choices, the character goes in to save the refugees or whatever it might be, you're saying something about the act of saving the refugees and what happens to that character as a result of that. If you're creating some simple throwaway comedy, if you're using cynical comedy or you're tearing things down for the laugh, you're ultimately saying something about what you think or feel about that thing that you're tearing down. So if you just tell a story, you just blast something out on the page and here's my story, it's going to have a meaning. It's going to have a point and a purpose, whether you intended to put that there or not. So the way I look at it is that the most powerful way to do this is to figure out what you're trying to say. What is that point? What is that purpose in the first place? And then take that and expand it into a story idea. We're going to figure out what is the point and the purpose, and then what is going to be the most effective way to express that? What is going to be the most effective way to engage an audience in a story that's going to convey that thing that you're trying to convey? Now, there's a lot to this, so I'm not going to be able to pack it all into this one episode. So understand the process itself. As we grow, as we find a character and a situation that the character going through the situation or the story that we're building conveys this meaning or this message or this point or this purpose. As the character does that, if we create a character and a situation that doesn't do that, or that gives off maybe the opposite meaning or makes the opposite point. Ultimately, we then know, well, if that's our point, that's what we're trying to get at, then we're going to need to change the story up a little bit. Now, it's entirely possible through the process of developing your story that you will find a new point or a new purpose. So I'm not suggesting that we have to hold on to things along the way. The process of discovery is largely the joy of storytelling and is largely what storytelling is all about. If you have an initial idea, you want to try a message you want to say to the world, and through the process of building a story, you realize, wait a minute, that's not actually right. Or, you know what, I don't want to say that after all. Well, then you adapt to what you've created along the way. It's okay. Your first draft may include a character or follow a character that's exactly putting the wrong vibe out there. And you go, you know what? I'm going to change my character entirely. Or this supporting character is actually the character who's going to best say what I'm trying to say. So what I'm getting at is that the process of story development is a process of discovery. If you know what your story is when you first set out on that journey, and the story ends up being exactly that, chances are you have not dug deep enough into your story. Chances are there's something more powerful, something more meaningful for the audience that you're not tapping into. So when you approach the story development process and we think about expanding it out, we're going to figure out what the character wants. We're going to figure out the obstacles or the goals that are going to, the obstacles or the roadblocks that are going to get in their way that they're going to have to overcome, that they're going to have to grow stronger through overcoming so that they can overcome that final battle. If we're talking about the traditional storytelling type. If we think about non-traditional narratives or maybe non-linear narratives, or using a structure that's not the classic Hollywood 3-act structure, it really becomes about how does the story begin? How does the story end? What has changed along the way? In some ways, the meaning of your story comes from what changed in your story. So usually the sort of the Hollywood model is that the character changes, right? Something happens in the character's life. They respond to it. As they respond to it, they find a goal. As they pursue that goal, the obstacles to achieving that goal get harder and harder. They grow and they learn along the way, and they become more capable of actually conquering the opponent of the story. And then in the final climax, they have that battle, and then they're changed in some way. So the character changes. So we see sort of this morality play. But that's not necessarily how all stories have to happen. You could have a city or a town that starts one way and at the end of the story ends another way. The characters don't actually change, but by doing the actions of the story, the town changes, and that would give you a different meaning that would convey something about the message of community. Or there are, at the end of the day, if you're thinking about story development, you can absolutely use the classic 3-act structure story. You can absolutely use a variation on it, or perhaps a whole new approach to story, something completely unique, something we've never seen before, as long as we understand that story is about change. And in the change is where the meaning is extracted from for the audience. Now, the story itself is going to be enjoyable or not enjoyable, satisfactory or not satisfactory to the audience if it exceeds their expectations, and if it gives them an emotional journey, if it gives them a ride that they experience that they like, or that not even that they like necessarily, but a journey that affects them in some way. If we think about genres, we think about comedy. We're giving laughter to the audience. If we think about horror, we're giving fear to the audience. If we think about action, we're giving adrenaline to the audience. If we think about drama, we're giving pathos. We're giving introspection and turmoil. At the end of the day, each of the genres is focused on giving the audience an emotional experience, right? So ultimately, we can think of story itself as an emotional experience that we're giving to the audience. Now, that emotional experience is going to convey some sort of meaning or message or point or purpose. And so when we're designing the story, we really need to think about designing the emotional roller coaster for the audience. And if we sit down and we figure out how to do that, where does the character start? Where does the end? How does that change happen? What does that to bring about the meaning, then we can start to identify what are the characters that we're going to need to go on that journey to make that happen. What opposition is going to need to happen to prevent that, and through that action is how our story unfolds. So from a process perspective, and again, I know I'm just scratching the surface here. We will dig way more into all this stuff as we go along. But from a process perspective, when you first have an idea for a story, and you want to turn it into something, we have to find some way to flesh it out. So my way of thinking is to figure out what you're trying to say, figure out what's the vehicle through which you're going to say it, and then start fleshing out the details of that. As you flesh those details out, you create yourself a story roadmap. So you're creating for yourself some sort of guideline that you can then use to steer the writing process. So if you remember last video, we talked about when you sit down to start writing, you tap into that flow, you can go off the rails. If you have a story plan in place, you know every 5 pages, you know roughly where you're going to be. If you know roughly where you're going to be every 5 pages, then you're basically writing to the next 5 pages. And you do that in that stream of consciousness style. So you do that tapping into your creative subconscious. So the whole point of the story development phase is to take the idea and give it shape, give it flesh. Understand who wants what, why they want what are the opposing forces, what are the conflicts, the obstacles they're going to face along the way. There are hundreds of different theories on this and lots of different approaches to it. Do not ever let anyone tell you there's only one story type, or that there are only 6 types of stories, or everything follows the hero's journey, or any of this kind of stuff. All of those things are tools. All of those things are things that you can use to help you find and shape your story. But ultimately, story is a journey that the audience is taking with the characters. We're vicariously experiencing the perspective and the story of the characters, and as they're making the choices in the story, we're going along with them for the ride. And as we do, we learn what they learn, we see what they see. Maybe if it's a different point of view, we see things that they don't even see. And because we've gone through that, because we're going through that journey, we end up extracting meaning that changes the way that we see the world, the way that we feel. Sometimes it's just mindless entertainment, just some way to escape and have fun and live somebody else's life in somebody else's world. So, story is a wide open book. I'm a big believer story is everywhere. I'm a big believer that everything is a story. Everything. This is a story. I don't know if I've already said this in this series, but there's a story of how this came to be on my desk. There's a story of how it came to be made. There's a story of how you got to be watching this right now. There's a story of how I got to be making this right now. There's a story in our potential interaction with one another. Everything is a story. So ultimately, your decision as a storyteller is to determine what stories are important to you. How do you know what stories are important to you? I believe you know that by tapping into what your passions are, what your unique perspective on the world is, what it means to you, why it's important to you to share with someone else, what you're trying to say to someone else, and then to find the vehicle through which to say that, the stories, the characters, the events, and the actions. So ultimately, from a process standpoint, everyone starts with an idea. We all have ideas in our heads. Every one of us, whether we know it yet or not, has an idea for a movie or many movies in our heads. We have to take that idea and make it tangible. Otherwise, it will forever be an idea in our head. Just like I said in the very first episode, that idea in your head is and will forever be an idea in your head until you take it out and you put it in front of you and let it meet with reality so that it can twist and turn based upon what reality sends you from that idea. So the idea for your story is just an idea until you start to make it real. What is it that you're trying to say? How do we go about trying to say that? I've included a lot of ideas in this episode. We'll include a lot more, including specific strategies and things you can do and actions you can take and ways to handle all of it as we go along. So this is not definitive by any stretch, but what we are doing, hopefully you can see, once you have taken that idea, turned it into a story plan, then you sit down and you blast out the story, tap it into your creative subconscious, you end up with a draft. Once you have a draft, you go through the rewrite process to make it a solid draft. Once you have a solid draft, you refine that, you turn it into a page-turner reader experience so that when someone picks it up, they cannot put it down. That's going to make them excited about reading it and giving you notes and feedback. And as you get that feedback, you're going to be able to interpret how your work is landing with the reader. When you understand how your work is landing with the reader, you can adapt and tweak and modify your project so that it lands exactly how you want it to land. Then you have a production-ready page-turner screenplay that you know is effective, that lands the way you want it to land. Then it's just a matter of hooking, pulling in, and connecting with the producer that's ideal for that project that's going to say yes and turn it into a screenplay. That is basically the process. Now, what we're going to talk about on Monday is that seventh phase, which I think makes all the difference in the world. It's the very first phase of it all, and absolutely nobody takes it seriously. So, bringing this back into a daily prompt. What you can do today is any action you want to do to move forward toward whatever project you're working on at this point. But if you've been doing anything through the episodes of the series, what I want you to think about is, what is it that you're trying to say with your story? And what is the vehicle through which you want to say it? Does that vehicle that you have identified actually say, or is it possible for it to actually say what you're trying to convey? Because if you choose a vehicle that says something else entirely, you're going to go down some very long paths, right? You can't necessarily know at the beginning how that's going to play out, because remember, this is a process of discovery, the writing process. You're going to write things that are going to send you in the wrong direction, that are going to show you the wrong direction, which will highlight what the right direction is. So don't ever be afraid of creating a story that's terrible or writing something that's awful. That's part of what writing is about. The story development phase is really about figuring out what you're trying to say, figuring out how you're going to say it, and then taking action. So whether you spend 10 minutes, whether you spend an hour, whether you spend 10 hours today, I want to make sure that you do not just continue to the next episode, that you stop, that you think, you process, you filter through your own point of view, and then you actually physically take action. Take physical action today. It's super important today, because if you're just taking these ideas and you're just letting them wash over you, you're not actually going to be getting anywhere with them. I understand that there's going to be a huge volume of episodes here very, very quickly, and it's going to be impossible to get up to speed without binge watching. I get that. But on some days, particularly this one, I really need you to take a moment to stop and process all this, because there is a lot here. We will break it out into a lot more detail later, but if you don't understand this, then we can't build upon this as we go along. So please understand this. Take a little bit of time with all of these videos in this reverse engineering part so you really understand this process in its entirety. And so think about it, process it. Leave a comment. Comment for me. If you're just lurking or you're just quietly in the background, please don't be shy. Please don't be afraid. Send me a comment. Let me know if you like it, if you don't like it, if there's something missing, something you don't understand. Please, questions and comments. I'm going to, in not too far into the future, we're going to start incorporating actual questions into the show so that we can go a bit deeper with some of the nuances of things that we've talked about. I've seen some amazing questions and comments along the way that help me go, oh, right, okay, you're seeing it this way. What I need you to see is this. I'm only able to incorporate that into the episodes to a degree because I'm still trying to lay out the initial framework and the initial context of this thing. But I want to get into all that stuff so that no question goes unanswered, so you know exactly how to get where you're trying to go. So please comment, make sure you're subscribed, click the bell icon to make sure that you do not miss a single episode of this. And then we'll see you tomorrow. Thanks for watching, guys.